In a previous video, we explored the cold palaces of the Ming Dynasty, where unwanted and forgotten consorts were erased through indifference and neglect. But long before the cold palace became an official concept, earlier versions were already taking shape. In the Tang Dynasty, this was the magnificent Shangyang Palace. It was here that the great female emperor Wu Zetian spent her final days in confinement. And it was here that tens of thousands of consorts were quietly abandoned and removed from history. But it didn't start out this way. Hey everyone, I'm Amy. Today we're going to visit the most beautiful palace of the Tang Dynasty and uncover how it became the most tragic destination of so many consorts during this time. Unlike most Chinese dynasties that functioned out of one capital city, the Tang Dynasty actually used a two-capital system. The first capital was the famous city of Chang'an, which is commonly remembered as the political heart of the empire. And to its east was Luoyang, another ancient city that served as an economic hub, linked to both the Grand Canal and the Yellow River, with the Luo River flowing along its southern edge. At the beginning of the Tang Dynasty, the imperial court, along with most of the imperial harem, would frequently migrate between the two cities. While Chang'an was officially the primary capital, it was more difficult to feed because it was located further to the west, surrounded by mountains, and grain had to be hauled through difficult terrain. In addition, Chang'an was originally designed to be a military stronghold, laid out in a strict symmetrical grid designed for easy management and control. Luoyang, on the other hand, was more organic and scenic. It was a city of waterways and gardens, and stories describe it as a city where the flowers and trees never know autumn, making it a perfect summer retreat. Around 675 CE, Emperor Gaozong stood on the high, scenic banks of the Luo River. He was so moved by the beauty of the landscape that he ordered the construction of a new palace, the Shangyang Palace. This project was assigned to the official Wei Hongji, who was a master of logistics with a unique vision for beauty. He made sure to design and build the most majestic palace of the Tang Dynasty. The Shangyang Palace was a glorious palace complex that spanned about 8 square kilometers. Described as using vibrant emerald and yellow glazed tiles that shone like jewels along the river, and was said to have amazed everyone who saw it. It wasn't just one singular building, it was actually 6 groups of palace buildings. The first was the Guanfeng Dian, which was the primary hall for administration, state ceremonies, and imperial audiences. Nearby was the Huachen Yuan, which was a private residential area used by the emperor and his immediate personal attendants. Next was the Lingzhi Yuan, named after the hoof of the mythical creature Qilin. Its name was intended to bless the virtuous descendants of the imperial family. This was a prestigious residence intended for the high-ranking consorts, such as the 4 named consorts and the 9 concubines. And then there was the Fenfang Dian, the primary harem zone, which was where the majority of the consorts were staying. At the center of the Shangyang Palace was the Ben Yuan, which housed the support and lower-ranked administration staff. And last, there was the West Shangyang Palace. This was a detached area to the west of the main Shangyang Palace area, and contained additional halls and extra courtyards for residence and work, and was often described as a side palace. The palace was famous for its sheer density of structures, reportedly housed dozens of halls, pavilions, and towers. It was a place of bamboo and emerald trees, where the air smelled of orange blossoms and laurel leaves. Using a series of channels, water from a nearby river was diverted into the Shangyang Palace, creating an artificial network of canals that branched throughout the palace complex. These canals ran under pavilions and buildings, surrounding all of the building areas and ensuring that the sound of running water was audible in every room. But this beauty was also isolating, making movement between each area restricted to heavily guarded bridges. And along the riverbank, there was a long corridor that stretched almost the entire length of the palace complex. From here, you could look out and see the people of Luoyang going about their lives. According to the famous poet Wang Jian, in Shangyang, the gardens never feel the autumn chill, as the river flows through every hall. The pavilion and buildings are filled with the laughter of palace girls, but the music only brings sorrow to the commoners who are excluded outside. Silk curtains drape the trees, descending to a stream where orange blossoms bloom. And the imperial carriage climbs the forested hill towards the majestic palace. I have read the legends of the ancient gods, and even the 9 heavens cannot surpass a journey through this place. But that's not all. According to legend, an ancient copper basin was discovered during the construction of the Shangyang Palace. On this basin was carved 长宜子孙, which translates to bless your descendants for all of time. This discovery was hailed as a divine blessing upon the Imperial Li family and the Tang Dynasty. In fact, the Shangyang Palace was so incredible that conservative court officials who wanted to stay in Chang'an tried to argue it was an example of excess. Unable to attack the emperor directly, they instead turned their criticism towards the official who led the project, Wei Hongji. These officials claimed that Wei Hongji made the palace too grand and too expensive, wasting too much of the empire's resources on frivolous decorations and palace designs. Emperor Gaozong loved the new palace, but didn't want to deal with these complaints. So he let Wei Hongji take the full blame as a scapegoat. Sadly, Wei Hongji was dismissed from office and stripped of his titles. From the very beginning, the Shangyang Palace was marked with excess and punishment. So the Shangyang Palace was beautiful, but it was just a summer retreat, right? Well, let's take a quick step back to 660 CE, before the Shangyang Palace was built. Emperor Gaozong's health had started to fail, and his Empress Wu Zetian began to take over state affairs of the empire. The emperor suffered from chronic illness, including poor eyesight and recurring strokes. The court records state that his doctors recommended that he spend more time in Luoyang for the fresh air and milder environment in order to alleviate his symptoms. In addition, for the next few years, the capital city Chang'an would be plagued with grain shortages, and the imperial court also had to frequently shift to Luoyang for pragmatic reasons. And once the court started to be held in Luoyang, Wu Zetian immediately recognized additional advantages. While the primary capital was Chang'an, it was filled with conservative government officials and noble families who tried to block Wu Zetian from power at every turn. Luoyang offered a fresh landscape for her, away from her stubborn opposition. During this time, the imperial court would stay in the Ziwei Palace while they were in Luoyang, which was the main palace of the preceding Sui dynasty. However, as travel to Luoyang became more frequent, the emperor wanted to build a new dedicated palace for his health and retirement. This was strongly supported by Wu Zetian, who much preferred staying in Luoyang instead of Chang'an. And so, the Shangyang Palace was constructed around 675 CE, not as a summer retreat, but as a new seat of power. Its scale, ornamentation, and position were meant to project imperial legitimacy at the highest level. Imperial banquets were held here, audiences were received, and the palace functioned as a visible symbol of the power of the Tang Dynasty outside of Chang'an. In 684 CE, Emperor Gaozong passed away, and Wu Zetian consolidated power as Empress Dowager. She quickly moved to establish Luoyang as the new primary capital of the empire, and the Shangyang Palace became the new primary palace. She even renamed Luoyang to Shendu, which meant divine capital. In 690 CE, Wu Zetian declared herself as emperor of her very own Wuzhou dynasty. For the rest of her rule, the Shangyang Palace was the center of the world. But the very walls of that palace that saw the peak of her power eventually became her prison. 15 years later, in the winter of 705 CE, Emperor Wu Zetian was forced to abdicate, and the Tang Dynasty was restored. She was confined to the Xianju Dian, a hall within the Huacheng Yuan of the Shangyang Palace. Wu Zetian became cut off from the rest of the world. Legends say that she withered in her final days. It is said that she stopped wearing makeup and tending to her hair, appearing so gaunt and aged that when her son, the new emperor, came to visit, he wept in shock. But she reportedly rebuked him, claiming that this was all because he had been too rushed for the throne. Wu Zetian died in the Xianju Dian in December of 705 CE. And with her death, the divine capital came to an end. Luoyang was quickly demoted back to the second capital, and the center of the empire moved back to Chang'an. Wu Zetian's brief but forced retirement set a heavy precedent for the Shangyang Palace. It proved that these beautiful halls were the perfect place to remove someone from the center of power without the messiness of a public execution. Even though Luoyang was no longer the primary capital, the Shangyang Palace remained a site of imperial significance. Starting in 713 CE, Emperor Shenzong would continue to travel between Chang'an and Luoyang, sometimes staying in Luoyang for long periods of time. For the next few decades, Emperor Shenzong would continue to hold grand banquets and handle state affairs within the halls of the Shangyang Palace. This was his preferred venue for showing off the empire's wealth and to intimidate and impress foreign visitors. Now, one of the things that Emperor Shenzong was famous for was the vast size of his imperial harem, with legends claiming upwards of 40,000 consorts. In order to accommodate this large number of consorts, some accounts suggest that the West Shangyang Palace had to be repurposed to primarily serve the imperial harem. And it was perfect for this role due to its more isolated and private location from the rest of the Shangyang Palace. It became the primary residence for many of the consorts, consisting of hundreds of interconnected rooms and courtyards. It also served as a training site for new consorts, where they were taught music, calligraphy, and etiquette. It is also said that academy scholars were often tasked with writing poems or songs for these thousands of consorts to perform, effectively turning the entire Shangyang complex into a stage waiting for a performance that rarely happened. These consorts were expected to practice their dance and music in order to maintain the magnificent atmosphere of the palace, even if their only audience was each other. The West Shangyang Palace became the grand waiting room of the imperial harem, where thousands of consorts would be on standby for a chance to meet the emperor, but most never would. With thousands of consorts and only one emperor, the imperial harem became a tragedy of probability. The vast majority of these consorts would never even see the emperor's face, let alone receive his favor. And then, in 736 CE, Emperor Shenzong left Luoyang for the last time, leaving many of his consorts behind. The halls of banquets grew quiet, and the palace began its final transformation, from a seat of government into a warehouse of consorts that the emperor no longer needed. Around 740 CE, the famous beauty Yang Yuhuan caught the emperor's attention and quickly became his favorite consort. A few years later, in 745 CE, Yang Yuhuan was promoted to the high rank of noble consort, becoming the famous Yang Guifei that many of us know today. Because there was no official empress at this time, Yang Guifei became the highest-ranked consort of the imperial harem and secured her place as the emperor's sole focus. Emperor Shenzong stopped following the harem rules of the Tang Dynasty and no longer rotated his favor amongst the consorts. The very system of the imperial harem had collapsed, and thousands of consorts suddenly became women with no functional role. But the imperial court couldn't just have these consorts hanging around if the emperor no longer had a need for them. And so, many of the consorts of the imperial harem were gradually sent to the Shangyang Palace in Luoyang. And being sent there, become synonymous with being retired. Life in this palace was now a strange mixture of luxury and neglect. While the consorts were surrounded by gold and jade, they were oft deprived of basic human connections. It was an exile without formally calling it punishment. Unable to leave and forbidden from communicating with the outside world, legends describe red leaf poetry, where some of these consorts would pick up fallen autumn leaves and write their words and poems on them. And then, by casting these leaves into the river, they hope that a stranger might find them, as a way to prove their existence. One leaf in these stories say, "The flowing water is in such a hurry, but the palace is idle all day long." But for every leaf found, thousands more disappeared into the water. And then, 10 years later, in 755 CE, the Anlushan Rebellion happened. It is said that the gardens of the Shangyang Palace were destroyed in order to create barricades to protect the city. But the defense of Luoyang would be in vain. In early 756 CE, the rebel forces would take over the city, and the officials and forces of Luoyang would retreat west to Chang'an. However, there was no escape plan for the consorts in the Shangyang Palace, and they were abandoned, left to fend for themselves. When Anlushan's rebel forces took over Luoyang, there was significant looting and pillaging. The consorts were left in a massive, high-walled complex with no food coming in and no guards to keep the rebels out. Later accounts describe a complete breakdown of order, with widespread killing and assault of the consorts. Some were taken as captives by the rebel soldiers. Some died in aftermath due to starvation or illness. Others took advantage of the chaos and fled, finally free from the prison of the Shangyang Palace. When the Imperial forces finally recaptured Luoyang at the end of 757 CE, they found that many of the palaces had been burned and were left in ruins. The surviving consorts were found, living in the remaining halls of the Shangyang Palace. They either had no place else to go or were too old to flee. Sadly, the imperial court did not want to pay to rebuild the Shangyang Palace, and they did not want to officially release the surviving consorts. So they left them abandoned in the ruins of the palace. These surviving consorts and their remaining attendants would continue to live in the ruined Shangyang Palace for the rest of their lives. Receiving only minimal supplies, they survived through small gardens, leftover stipends, informal exchange, and mutual support. They were no longer guarded, but they were still not free. The abandoned consorts were still registered as palace women, which meant they could not legally marry, own land, or travel between different provinces. They could not be legally registered to another household, and would become a fugitive subject to arrest if they were to just leave. While the Shangyang Palace became a graveyard of dreams, the imperial harem itself did not cease to exist. Even as the consorts of Luoyang were abandoned, a separate, active harem continued to function in Chang'an. After the Anlushan Rebellion, new consorts were sent directly into the inner courts of Chang'an. The glory of Luoyang had come to an end, and with it, the practice of housing thousands of consorts in a second city. For the later emperors of the Tang Dynasty, the imperial harem became centralized in Chang'an, while the survivors of the Shangyang Palace became living ghosts of a forgotten time. Finally, in 791 CE, the Shangyang Palace disappeared from the imperial palace registers, effectively ending all official provisioning and supervision. Any remaining consorts that were still living there were also likely released from imperial service, allowing them to leave, return to relatives, or live out the rest of their days in temples. But were any of them still alive? Did it even matter anymore? Many years later, around 809 CE, the legendary poet Bai Zhiyi wrote his famous poem, The White-Haired Woman of Shangyang. Bai Zhiyi originally wrote this poem as a caution for Emperor Shenzong, the grandson of Emperor Xuanzong. He was trying to warn the emperor to not repeat the mistakes of his grandfather, using the ruins of the Shangyang Palace as a symbol of a golden age that became bogged down by excess and eventually collapsed. Here is the story of the white-haired woman of Shangyang, representing all of the consorts that became trapped in the Shangyang Palace. Her journey began when she was just 16. At the time, her face was as radiant as a blooming lotus, and her skin as smooth as white jade. When she was selected for the Imperial Palace during the final years of Emperor Xuanzong's reign, her family and neighbors all whispered that she was destined for greatness. They told her that entering the inner chambers meant receiving imperial favor and a life of luxury. But she knew only the pain of the party. She had to swallow her grief and choke back her sobs as she was helped into the carriage, strictly forbidden from crying as the gates of her old life closed forever. She was one of over 100 young women chosen that year, but the favor she was promised never came. Before she could even catch a glimpse of the emperor's face, she was intercepted by the cold eyes of Yang Guifei. Was it jealousy? She was secretly diverted and banished to the isolation of the Shangyang Palace. The gates were locked by green-robed eunuchs, and just like that, her youth was sealed away. Decades passed in a blur of empty rooms. The flower-like beauty she once possessed vanished in secret, replaced by hair that eventually turned as white as silver. Her life became a repetitive cycle of seasonal sorrow. In the autumn, the nights felt impossibly long. She would lie awake, unable to sleep, watching the sky and waiting for a dawn that refused to break. Her only companion was a dim, flickering lamp that cast a lonely shadow of her back against the wall, while the whistling dark ring hammered incessantly against the window panes. In the spring, the days stretched out, slow and agonizing. She would sit alone for hours, watching the sun take forever to set. The songs of the palace birds, which should have been joyful, became a sound she loathed, a reminder of a world that was still singing while she was forgotten. She watched the swallows nesting in pairs on the rafters. When she was young, it made her envious, but as she grew old, even that envy died away. She eventually stopped counting the years by the calendar, marking time only by the moon. She watched it rise in the east and set in the west, counting 400 or 500 full moons from behind the palace walls. Now, over 60 years old, she is the oldest woman left in the Shangyang Palace. Of the 100 girls who entered with her, she is the sole survivor. Her fragile body, the only thing remaining of that time. When word of her long service finally reached the current emperor, he granted her the honorary title of Lady Secretary, a hollow, symbolic honor bestowed from a great distance that changed nothing about her daily isolation. But perhaps the most tragic sight is her appearance. She still dressed exactly as she did 44 years ago, in the small-headed shoes and narrow garments that were the height of fashion at the end of that time period. She still used pigment to paint her eyebrows thin and long, unaware that the world outside has long since moved on. She is a ghost of the past. If people from the outside world were to see her, they would surely laugh at her outdated style, not realizing they were looking at a life frozen in time. From youth to old age, her life has been defined by a bitterness that never wavers. As the poets say, one need only look at her white hair to understand the tragedy of the Shangyang Palace, a place where a woman's entire existence is consumed by the silence of an empty room. The Shangyang Palace was a terrible paradox. It was beautiful, magnificent, and grand. And yet, it was also an unimaginable nightmare. We started by saying this wasn't called a cold palace yet, but the distinction is almost entirely semantic. If the Ming Dynasty cold palace was a small, enclosed punishment yard, the Tang Dynasty version was an enormous palace complex where consorts were abandoned. This was the cruelty of the Shangyang Palace. It provided everything a human heart could desire: beauty, nature, and luxury, but not the one thing a human heart needs: a way out. In 1989, the archaeological teams in Luoyang finally unearthed the foundations of the Shangyang Palace. Today, parts of the site have been restored and turned into the Shangyang Palace Cultural Park. But while there are now modern recreations of the beautiful palace buildings for us to visit, the stories of the consorts who lived there have mostly been forgotten. We often look for a villain in these stories, but the truth of Shangyang Palace is more chilling. It reminds us that a cold palace doesn't require a cruel warden or a dark dungeon. It only requires a system that values property over people. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. If you liked today's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.